It has been a very busy first 2 weeks on the campaign trail. Lots of news to pick over, lots of detail to digest. I'm Charlie Conchie, Chief City Reporter at City A.M, back with Bonds and Ballots, an election relaunch of Bonds and Ballots, where every Friday we'll be picking over some of the news of the week and particularly some of the detail for business. And I'm very pleased to be joined by my colleague, our political guru, Jess Frank-Keys, to pick over, do a bit of a post-mortem on the week so far. The 2 weeks that have come before. How's it been so far for you?
Oh, it's been busy and there's still 4 weeks to go. So yeah, bring it on.
Let's get into some of the details so far. We're speaking on the morning after the debate. We've seen a bit of a post-match analysis already. Some polls had it 51-49 in favour of Sunak. What were your first impressions coming away from that? Was it the punch-up you expected?
Well, it was a big moment on the campaign trail for both parties, both party leaders, and for a lot of people in the country who don't follow politics quite as obsessively as some of us are lucky enough to do. It will have been maybe their first real encounter with, who is Keir Starmer. I think we're all a bit more familiar with Rishi Sunak based on COVID press conferences, furlough, all these things that have gone on over the past few years. But for some people, Labour are definitely a bit more of an unknown quantity, and that's reflected in business as well, I feel. But yes, definitely a bit of a punch-up. It was a feisty debate. I think I put it as they weren't quite tearing chunks, but maybe nuggets out of each other. So yeah, policy-wise, they had a lot to introduce. Well, Keir Starmer had a lot to introduce to voters, but
lots of my dad was a toolmaker.
There was a lot of that. There was a Pebble Dash semi in there, I think, or if not, I've heard it one too many times. But yeah, I think one thing that did strike us, and we were discussing this earlier, was a bit of an absence of a coherent economic business tax focus there. Because when you've got this debate, this is on ITV primetime, this is talking to the ordinary voters, and it's about that broad-based appeal. And I think we may see a lot more policy emerge as the manifestos are launched, and you really get into the detail of what the parties are offering to businesses, to the city. The first debate of the campaign, is that the moment for it? We're not quite so sure.
Well, there was this interesting figure that has been bandied around a bit today. It was rolled out by Sunak last night, this figure that a Labour government would mean £2,000 more tax per household. That has sort of been contentious today. There's been a Treasury official saying it didn't come from us. What are the actual details behind that? Was there any weight to that figure?
This is an interesting one, and there has been a real row over this today. It's a bit of a complicated explanation, but it's common for party and government can ask the Treasury, ask government to look at the opposition parties' figures that they're proposing. However, what's put forward to the government is put together by political advisors for the Conservative Party. So they present the Treasury with those policy proposals. The Treasury come back with the costings. This is why they're able to argue that they're independent costings, but are they based on policy proposals which may have been influenced by politics? You see the issue here.
So they've been presented in a sort of impartial way and then perhaps packaged up with a little bit of spin.
I'd say so. And I think what a lot of people were pointing out last night is Keir Starmer was a bit slow during the debate to deliver those rebuttals. We ended up towards the end of the debate, him calling them absolute garbage. We had Labour spinners out on the airwaves today and last night, talking about how calling Rishi Sunak a liar, effectively. And, it's politics, it's a bit of rough and tumble. They are going to be going for each other like this during the campaign. But people will have possibly seen it as a bit of a weakness on the Labour side that he wasn't able to get there and deliver that, outright rejection. It's not the case. I'm not saying that Labour will be putting up your taxes by £2,000, but Labour have committed to specific tax rises, which was a phrase Keir Starmer used during the debate. They have outlined what those will be. They have outlined what those will go towards funding, predominantly public services. But it's for voters to decide.
So a lot of this feels like it's sort of an issue coming out of a vacuum. We haven't seen a huge amount of detail, and it's been filled by allegations, suggestions coming from either side, which we can expect to an extent. But is there that detail actually there yet? We haven't had manifestos. Business particularly has been calling for a lot of detail over the past week. I've been writing about manifestos from the CBI, the BCC, all calling for various different intricate tax policies, tax plans, closer ties with the EU. Is the issue fundamentally that we just haven't got the detail yet and we're filling a vacuum?
I think that's right. And I think it speaks to we won't call it a snap election because this is coming, very close to the end of a 5-year parliament. with just sort of 6 months to go, really. But the manner in which it was called, it did take people in Westminster by surprise. And I think you can tell that based on the candidate selections we've seen going on over the past 2 weeks. The deadline for the parties to select all of their candidates to stand in all the seats they want to put someone forward in is this Friday. So they've had a lot to do quite quickly over the last 2 weeks to get their people lined up into place, you know, websites launched and activists out on the doorstep. And that's been the real focus for them of this first fortnight of the campaign. With that deadline passed, we're then edging into, you know, we've got the debates, you know, coming as well on the BBC over the next few weeks. But crucially, we'll have the manifestos. And that's where businesses are going to see the detail that they want to see, the detail that you're talking and writing about. That's not to say the parties at this point don't have those policy proposals, that detail. They'll have been working on this for months, if not years. It's just that at the moment, things are still quite tightly under wraps, and, you know, enterprising political journalists everywhere will be aiming to get that leaked to them as soon as possible. My DMs are very much open.
I mean, we have seen a couple of sort of softly trailed policy proposals, tax policy proposals for the city particularly. There's a few that have unsettled people. There's a few that Labour's committed to, like not raising corporation tax, for instance. But I think one of the interesting ones that we've seen discussed a bit about, and there was a hint at it in the debate last night, was this idea of taxing private equity deal makers, carried interest earned by those private equity deal makers, lifting the rate on that. That's something you've been asking Rachel Reeves a bit about in the past few months. Is that an issue you see becoming a bit of a flashpoint between the Labour Party, particularly in the city?
That's right, and I think this is one at City A.M we've covered with some interest, no pun intended. But yeah, I spoke to Rachel Reeves about this I believe a few weeks ago now, during the mayoral election campaign when Sadiq Khan obviously was re-elected in London, and she was very clear at that stage that Labour were very much committed to increasing the rates of interest on private equity bonuses. That's something which is in a bit of a contrast with Labour's increasingly lukewarm, warm relationship towards the city, which they've been very much putting out there over the last few months of smoked salmon and scrambled egg breakfasts, and, you know, Jonathan Reynolds going around all the big white collar firms, and yeah, really making friends there. So it's an interesting one. I think we will see some pushback. We will see more pushback from the city on this, and I think we will also see a push from Labour's existing or previous voter base. They're increasingly looking to win the centre ground, to win, you know, Middle England voters, to come across as not only unthreatening, but, you know, actively embracing, you know, big business, big corporations. That's been a very important part of their transformation under Keir Starmer, they would say. We will see that tension there, and it will be interesting to see how wedded they remain to that policy. I could see a divorce could be messy. Another
sort of policy we've seen from the Labour Party is this plan around workers' rights. Again, unsettled some segments of the business community. It would mean a big overhaul for some sections. How has that plan actually landed now, and what form has it taken? Because there have been a few tweaks to that over the past few months.
Yeah, absolutely. This is another interesting one, and I think this is very much something where we've had a lot of heat and light on this. It's been very visible, and that's been because of meetings that Labour's had with the trade unions, which are their backers, funders in some cases, to get this hammered out and get to a form of words which they can get on board with, which also suits businesses and employers. That's been a crucial part of those negotiations. And yes, we have seen some changes from the time it was first introduced. They have reached that point, however, and it's been a bit of oil has been poured on troubled waters for a while. And I think this has kind of gone back under the surface. But we will see this rearing its head again, I think, at the manifesto stage, because I think it will be, or there will be some form of words in the manifesto alluding to this. What exactly it will be guaranteeing, promising, you know, we wait and see. But similarly, if, as many people expect, you know, nothing's for certain yet, but increasingly the expectation is Labour will enter government, this is a first 100 days commitment for them, whether that's to introduce legislation into House of Commons, have that legislation passed into law, you know, depends, we will see. But it's very much going to rear its head again, and I think provide another real point of contention for, potentially a Labour government.
So lots of plans that still need to be ironed out there, lots of details still to come. But you're right, it's something that city firms, businesses do seem to be a bit nervous about. And I'm very pleased to say in the next part of this show, we're going to be speaking with a leading employment lawyer from a city law firm who's going to be taking us through a bit of how companies are actually preparing for those plans in practice and what it will mean for businesses across the city.
So, Andrew, the New Deal for Workers, as it was once called, there's been a few changes to it now. It seems like it's caused a bit of a brouhaha in the city. Businesses feel like they've been a bit unsettled by it. Unions have been angry. There's been tweaks now to the document a few times. Can you just take us through, I suppose, what actually have been the sticking points within that and why it has sort of unsettled some businesses?
The original document caused some concern among businesses because it looked as if it was creating absolute positions, banning 0 hours contracts, definitely no fire and rehire, changes to worker status, and there didn't seem to be any exceptions. And that would usually cause some concern among business because they want to have some flexibility. Of course, that may be a position that the union wanted. It was keen to have absolute positions on important areas. The new document, the Make Work Pay document, has some flexibility built into it. So it says, for example, in fire and rehire, that can happen where there are genuinely no alternatives. And that's caused some concern and issue among the unions. So they say we would have preferred a more absolute position. And so why has this come about? I think the government, or new government in terms of the Labour Party, will want to ensure that there is flexibility. It's got to create a partnership between business, trade unions and the government, and it will have recognised that there needs to be some flexibility.
There's obviously, you touched on it there, there's been a political reframing of this almost from the outright New Deal for Workers to suddenly making work pay. And within some of those key elements you picked out there, so fire and rehire, for instance, that felt like it came into the public consciousness almost through the pandemic, as it became a big issue for business there. What does that actually mean in practice, firing and rehiring for businesses, and what is this document proposing changing?
So you're right, it did come about generally through the pandemic. There was a high-profile fire and replace by P&O, and that captured the public imagination and concern. And the Labour Party said that it wants to outlaw that kind of practice. It says it's bad for business. And originally it had said, we're just not going to allow fire and rehire at all. Now it says, well, we'd only allow it in exceptional circumstances if there was no genuine alternative. Why do businesses do this? Usually it's a last resort where there are pay or terms and conditions that the company can no longer either afford or doesn't want to continue with. It tries to get employees to agree to make the changes. Employees won't agree. So as a last resort, employers give notice to terminate and offer a new contract with the revised terms.
And 0 hours contracts as well. I mean, we can almost imagine what they are, fairly self-explanatory in the name, but there's been a key change since January in the wording there. We've had the word exploitative slipped in now. Is there clarity on what exploitative actually means within that?
No definition of exploitative. What we think it means is to allow some flexibility again to try to create this business union government partnership so that in exceptional circumstances certain alternative positions would be allowed. I think there's a recognition by the Labour Party that some people actually want genuine 0 hours contracts because that's the way they want to work. But the baseline position in the Make Work Pay document suggests that over a 12-week reference period, there would be a calculation of what your usual hours would be, and that would be what you are entitled to.
And then day one rights, we've touched on as well, another area that has both parties, rather than political parties, the unions and business sort of pulling in different directions. What's the kind of sticking point there? Why is that still such a balancing act for the Labour Party to tread?
I think the general view is that businesses like the flexibility of having a 2-year window within which they could decide whether an employee was someone they wanted to keep or part ways with, because that was the qualifying period for basic rights such as unfair dismissal. An arrangement where you got all those rights on day one means that potentially parting ways with an employee might be much more expensive, especially if that was coupled with the removal of the unfair dismissal compensation cap. So businesses would have said, well, this isn't going to work for us if you're creating another binary position where as soon as we've employed someone, they've got unfair dismissal protection, for example. You need to build in some flexibility. The Make Work Pay document suggests that perhaps the flexibility is in probationary periods. It doesn't give lots of detail, but it suggests that employers would still be able to terminate a relationship during the probationary period, as long as it was for a good reason and through some fair process. But it doesn't give detail about that yet.
So since the plan was first published, we have seen there's been nerves, there's been jitters among the business community. I don't think people have outright wanted to come out in opposition to the plan. But you're at the coalface of this, employment lawyer. You've seen what the city reaction's been like. What is the mood among businesses at the moment? How have they actually been reacting, preparing to sort of get ready for these plans to come in?
I think there's some reassurance in the Make Work Pay document, so the revised document, that there is a recognition that binary positions are not good ones for businesses. There needs to be a bit of flexibility. So that has been acknowledged. I know we've recently seen 120 businesses write in support of Labour as a new government, which would be positive for business. And I think the new document does give credentials to the Labour Party that it's going to try to make a partnership umbrella between business, unions and the new government.
So
work.
The revisions have, in your view, seemed to kind of settle some of those concerns among businesses?
I think they've settled some. Of course, there's uncertainty because there's not a lot of detail around how some of the exceptions might work. So perhaps the corresponding confidence among business leaders in the new Labour Party ideals, probably trade unions are slightly more unsettled about them because they will be concerned that businesses and their legal representatives will try to find ways around the new legislation.
So a balancing act still to be struck.
Definitely a balancing act, and I think that's going to be the key to success. If the Labour Party is going to achieve a positive outcome in terms of workers' rights and genuinely make work pay, then it has to achieve a balance between keeping businesses confident, managing trade union expectations, and genuinely giving the workforce positive views on the working future.
So we've touched on the business reaction there. The other big side of this is obviously the unions. It's them that is so sort of enraged by the suggestion that fire and rehire could still be on the table. What has the reaction been like from the unions now, and what more could we expect in pushback from them?
You're right, the unions are at the heart of this, and they'll be looking at what's in the Make Work Pay document for them. And there are some positive things for them, more opportunity to have access to the workplace, which at the moment is often difficult for trade unions, maybe makes the trade union recognition process a bit simpler. The document says it's going to take away some of the archaic procedural restrictions and also simplify some of the rules on industrial action, which may make it more straightforward for industrial action processes to go through, including modernisation of the balloting system, which currently is by post only. The document suggests that it's going to modernise that.
So we could see it made easier to strike almost for workers?
Possibly so, or certainly easier, a more streamlined process to go through to see whether strike action should take place. And that must be something that unions would have wanted, because they say they don't want to strike, but having that ability is something that holds businesses to account.
So unions likely to be placated for the time being?
They ought to be reasonably pleased with what's offered in the Make Work Pay document in terms of access to workplaces, making balloting systems easier, and making recognition processes more modernised.
So Labour win is looking increasingly likely, still a comfortable polling lead. If they do come into government, what is the sort of timeline? How are these actually going to be brought into law?
So what the Make Work Pay document has said, and generally what the publicity has been, is that within the first 100 days, the new government, if it's the Labour Party, will introduce new legislation. Of course, that means we'll probably not have any new legislation until 2025, but in the introduction process, I'm sure businesses, trade unions and their respective advisors will be looking very closely at the detail and also there's been publicity about consultation with businesses. So it will be interesting to see what questions are asked and what responses are given.
Still plenty of questions and details to come then. But Andrew, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you very much.